The season of Lent begins on Wednesday, a season where we turn our lives around, repent, and change our lives from within so that we follow God more closely. With this definition of Lent in mind, I'm reminded of the comedian George Carlin and his famous quip, which made him sound almost like a prophet as we enter the season of Lent this Wednesday. He said, "I put $1 in a change machine, nothing changed." Imagine if there were such an easy way to change the world or change our lives. Just plunk $1 into a change machine. Poof! Instant transformation. Instant spiritual awareness. Instant spiritual growth. But that's not how it works. Instead, if we want change, we have to work for it and at it. And for change to be successful, we need to have a vision from God for what is possible. This vision comes from study, penitence, and reflection. Many Christians will use this season to focus on these areas of growth in their life by inspecting them. And they'll do this by either fasting for 40 days, just as Jesus fasted in the desert, or they will observe Lent by participating in a prayer labyrinth, while others will take a trip to mountaintops to communicate with God, just as Jesus did. Still others will travel to the Isle of Iona in Scotland to seek God's presence in the thin places. In the 8th century Celtic church, early Christians believed that thin places were where heaven and earth came close, that they physically touched. One author described thin places as a location where the distance between heaven and earth collapses, thus allowing us to catch a glimpse of the divine. He explained that thin places beguile and inspire, sedate and stir. They are places where, for a few blissful moments, we loosen our death grip on life and we can breathe again. In Celtic writings, when the early monks referred to thin places, though they specifically were writing about the various locations on the Isle of Iona, they also referenced other locations as well, like Stonehenge in England. Their description of thin places is similar to the high places that are identified in the Old Testament and the New. High places or thin places exist wherever humanity is able to catch a glimpse of God. Examples in the biblical narrative are in the Old Testament, such as when Moses saw a burning bush that didn't burn. At the point that he saw this, he was in a high place. Later, when Moses was leading the Hebrews to the Holy Land, he climbed Mount Sinai and was in a high place when he received the 10 Commandments. Elsewhere in the Bible, when Jacob wrestled an angel before meeting with his brother Esau, the location was referred to as a high place. In our New Testament scripture reading this morning, Jesus and the disciples were on a mountain in a high place or a thin place when they encountered the divine. Unlike the experiences of these biblical heroes, discovering a thin place does not always mean what we receive as a grandiose spiritual awakening. However, those who encounter thin places report that following their experience with the divine, they saw the world in a new way. One author writes of his experience that thin places have the ability to jolt us out of the old ways of seeing the world. Though it's pretty exciting to anticipate an encounter with a thin place, at the same time, many who have experienced these thin places warn that the hardest part about the experience is the transformation that happens within the soul. After witnessing a vision of how God desires the world to operate, it can be challenging to live into the new way God desires because old ways of living are difficult to let go of. Certain things have been done a certain way for a long time, and for some, an inward crisis develops because they want to put away their old views, their bad habits, their old ways of living life, but it's tough to live into the newness God has in store. Typically, new ways of living requires some type of change. For example, sometimes the vision requires a change in how people are treated, or a different way of providing care for others. Sometimes the vision God casts requires a change or shift in how we view the world. All of these can be challenging, just as they were challenging for Jesus' first century audience. When Jesus challenged his followers to shift their way of life from being stuck in old patterns of sin and death to embrace a new way of life in God, Jesus provided them a vision of what the world could look like if it pursued peace and justice and walked humbly with God. And Jesus empowered his disciples to join him as he identified people who struggled for peace and justice and were hungry and homeless, but often were ignored. And he provided an example for his disciples to imitate so that they could believe as he believed, to live as he lived, and to care as he cared. On multiple occasions, Jesus taught using parables and stories so the people could understand God's great love and the way they should live and the way they should love. Jesus knew that for the culture to shift from the old ways to God's new way, he would have to name how the current culture was broken and no longer working. And then he would cast a vision of the opportunities available. He did this when he declared that if people followed God and cared for each other, the world would be blessed. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And even though we call these the Beatitudes, how often do we hear them, but we don't live them? As one person said before, why put the 10 Commandments on the court wall when it should be the Beatitudes? Live into them. Embrace them. This is the newness that God desires. And he declared that if you do these things, then you will care for people. After proclaiming the good news, Jesus would then sit privately with his disciples and help them understand and discover the great depths of his lessons. During one of those private moments prior to Jesus' transfiguration in a thin place, Jesus asked them to consider what type of Messiah he truly was, asking, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Well, the disciples quickly resort to the buzzwords that they've been hearing about Jerusalem. Well, you're a good teacher, or you're a powerful prophet. But it's Peter who correctly responded to Jesus' question, saying, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus commended Peter for his response. However, as Peter was prone to do, he got one response correct and then immediately decided to put his foot in his mouth by exploding at Jesus when Jesus rocked his worldview by proclaiming that contrary to popular belief, the Messiah did not come to raise an army and attack evil with violence. Rather, he would suffer and die and then rise from the dead. Well, this challenge was too much for Peter, and it was too much for him to let go of the old worldview. And even though he had witnessed Jesus perform miraculous healings, his mind was just unable to grasp Jesus' revelation. Further, Peter held firmly to the belief that the Messiah was going to confront evil through violent resistance. Thus, Peter revealed that even though he heard Jesus deliver the message of peace and forgiveness on the Sermon on the Mount, even though he had started to kind of understand the Beatitudes, especially when Jesus taught, turn the other cheek when you receive violence and offer a non-violent resistance, Peter was unable to embrace the vision Jesus cast. He was unable to grasp that Jesus had called his followers to a new way of life. Jesus once again gathered the disciples around him and explained that he was on his way to Jerusalem to take on evil, but he would conquer evil in an unexpected way through sacrifice And he instructed them, if you want to become my followers, then you need to take up your cross as well. Jesus reminded them of the message he had taught, adding, if you want the world to change, then don't try to defend or attempt to save your life. Do not avenge yourselves, but trust God and respond non-violently to resist evil. Love your enemies and love those who persecute you. In this way, you will defeat them through forgiveness. Admittedly, Jesus' lessons seem countercultural and difficult to follow. On the other hand, choosing to live into the vision Jesus cast can be rewarding because people can recognize our religious convictions, which allows them to experience God and grasp onto God's vision for the world. And it can be done by people who don't even buy into the vision. For example, in 1938, a young man named George MacLeod from Glasgow, Scotland, was saddened at the poor conditions of the unemployed and the homeless. He sought God in prayer, and some might say he discovered a thin place because he received a vision that changed his life. He believed he was supposed to travel to the Isle of Iona, where he would recreate a spiritual center at the old abandoned Iona Abbey. And there he would create space for people to grow food and gather together for community meals. He believed he could create jobs for the unemployed by hiring them to rebuild the abbey and the other buildings on the island of Iona. There was just one major problem. George had no money. And secondly, none of the original buildings on Iona were there anymore. Iona sticks out into the ocean, and the winds there, especially in winter, just whip through. And since the Iona Abbey had been abandoned for at least 40 years, 1899 was the last it had been used, the winds just swept the buildings right off the island. So George had two problems. He wanted buildings with no money, and he wanted to employ people with no money. He went to several wealthy patrons, at least he hoped they'd be patrons, and the one of them, or at least the first person he encountered, said, you need a good psychiatrist. The second person he approached was the richest man he knew, Sir James Lithgow, who owned the shipyard where the warships were being built. Sir James responded to George, I'll give you £5,000 right now if you give up pacifism. George replied, not on your life. Smiling, Sir James responded, good, here's your £5,000. So Sir James, who didn't believe in pacifism, believed that George was convicted. And even though James did not buy into the idea of creating peace on earth, he became the largest benefactor for the group. Unwilling to compromise, George remained true to God and was truly rewarded. Then, with the vision strong in his heart, he restored the Iona community, which in turn has blessed multiple communities. Even today, Iona continues to bless spiritual sojourners who visit the community seeking God in the thin places. For some visitors, they discover thin places on the Isles of Iona, and they catch a glimpse of God, which results in transformed lives, just as the lives of the disciples were changed after Jesus led them up to a thin place there on the mountain peak. Transfigured, Jesus was unmasked, and he revealed his true connection with God. And at that point, the disciples recognized he truly was Emmanuel, God with us. And the disciples realized Jesus was the true embodiment of God. In a flash of light and a voice that surrounded the disciples, the veil between heaven and earth was lifted to reveal God's kingdom. And in that moment, the disciples saw God's dazzling glory in Jesus. The vision transformed the disciples because they briefly saw the world through Jesus' eyes. They saw that the world was stuck in a pattern of brokenness, sin, and death. And they realized the world neglected to care for its poor and sick. They realized hate was strong. And this was the reason they believed they should remain hidden on the mountain peak in shelters to build. And fearful of the vision that said, you are not going to remain here. You will go down back to the people and you will help them. They were fearful, but Jesus touched them. And in that moment, His touch revealed that through them, the world can be healed because evil may be strong, but love is far stronger. They realized it was their responsibility to return from the mountain peak and help the culture change so it would become a reflection of God's goodness, mercy, and love. With Jesus' touch, the disciples realized that they can guide their culture by word and example so that the world can become a reflection of God's kingdom. However, even with the realization of what they were supposed to do to help people shift their lives into God's new way of life, and even with the phrase, listen to Him, which echoed in their heads, it was difficult for them to let go of their old patterns of life. They clung onto the old ways of brokenness and sin. Peter, for example, pursued the old ways of life. He preferred personal comfort and protection. And so even with the transfiguration, he went to Jesus to Jerusalem, where he denied Jesus 3 times. I tell you, I don't know that man. Thankfully for Peter, and thankfully for us, after Jesus' resurrection, He forgave Peter and revealed God's new way, which is breaking into our world. In Jesus, God breaks through this veil that separates heaven and earth. And it's in those places that we can experience God, these thin places, which remind us God is everywhere and anytime. It is in these thin places that we can encounter the Spirit breaking into us, breaking up our old ways of life, and in helping us embrace a new way of being, of doing, of thinking, and of caring. Jesus revealed to Peter how we live this new way, teaching, love your neighbors, serve your neighbors, clothe your neighbors, feed your neighbors, and care for each other. Put the needs of others before your own. And when we do this, we provide a thin place for our neighbors so together we can experience the life-transforming power of God. During this season of Lent, we are encouraged to seek thin places so we can catch a glimpse of God and experience the closeness that God provides. And the season of Lent, we are able to pray and reflect on Jesus' life so that as we emerge into Easter, we can be a post-Easter people, transformed for God's glory and ready to let the old ways of selfishness die, thus allowing us to embrace a new way of living and giving and being present for our neighbors. We can be the change we desire. We can be the change God has in store for the world if we stop being selfish and start living for others. Who knows? Maybe we are the change machine. Thus we can work with God and change the world. Anybody have $1?